I'm not going to ask a question, but I'm going to make a series of comments in response to this. The first thing that really struck me is the reliance on this product wage story, which in a way it's exactly the same argument that's made to say why our manufacturing sector is in good health. You deflate our nominal manufacturing output, and suddenly we've got a huge increase in real manufacturing output. And that's a story that is told over and over again about the health of U.S. manufacturing. And I think I disagree with it. I wonder if Alan Blinder were here, what he might say, because I think the next book to come out after Blue Collar Blues might be White Collar Woes. We could see from globalization sudden pressure on white collar wages, and then you'd start to get wage inequality decreasing, I guess. Now, that might be good in terms of an inequality story, but I don't think it'd be much consolation to the white collar workers who then start to feel the problem. I think this issue, therefore, inequality can take, I see the purpose of the study here, to somehow sort of put trade in a better light and take the pressure off this trade debate, but the same sort of issues here apply, for instance, say, with union wages. We've taken out the low-paid union wages, and as a result, union wages are now maybe, the union manufacturing is a small part of the union membership. Consequently, therefore, union wages will stop falling in response to trade. But again, that's small consolation to the manufacturing workers who lost their jobs as a consequence. Another thing that why these type of wages might cease falling is because of wage floors in our economy. At some stage, you begin to drive wages closer to the minimum wage. They bunch together at the bottom, and then again, you're going to have this problem. You're going to have this issue of wage inequality not rising. Again, that's no consolation to the workers who've been driven down to that bottom. Final point here. Actually, I see some interesting convergences, though, in where you were wanting to push the agenda. I guess Bob Nardelli would be very glad to have you working for him, or Stan O'Neill, or Chuck Prince, because they're the best too. But it strikes me that with regard to the explanation there, the problem of the best has always existed. Why did it suddenly explode so much? The best, we wanted the best to be CEOs according to that logic in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s as well. We've always had get the best CEO there. So why suddenly explode it now? And then, again, in terms of your class inequality story, you said that there was no profit increase. Well, in that case, there shouldn't have been this huge, the wage share has been fairly constant. Remember, we're in this Cobb-Douglas world. Therefore, it shouldn't have been this explosion in CEO pay. I think you're right there, that leads to two very important things. I'd like to move away from the trade debate, and I think the issue should be globalization, which is a much bigger phenomena than trade. It should be financialization. How do financial markets drive what's going on in the global economy and in our economy? And how do we get a corporate agenda on board? How do we change corporations? So yes, your study in some ways begins to lead to some very interesting new policy agendas. Now, I know there's a lot there, but I think that this is a sort of a response to some of those ideas we just heard.
Should I respond? I don't know why you think you understand my motives. I guess. I try to write a study which sort of explained phenomenon as best as I could. If I gave you the impression I think workers should be happier because their pay would buy them a lot of computers in which they have no interest, then I'm very sorry for that. I didn't imply they were better off or well off at all. I think the consumer price index is the right way to look at how workers will feel with their wages. So I wasn't saying that at all. What I was trying to inquire was, is there something that is there to redistribute? That's what the focus of that first section is. And the answer is, if it's going into some other kinds of products, there isn't anything there to redistribute. And so the purpose of the first section was to distinguish between those two. White-collar threat. I had a debate with Alan Blinder, as did several other people, at Harvard last year. What's very interesting is that Alan has measured all of the workers who he believes are potentially vulnerable to outsourcing. So not actually vulnerable, but potentially vulnerable. He tells us it's a very big number. It turns out he comes to the conclusion that it is 25% of the American workforce. However, included in that number already are the 12% of workers who today are in manufacturing, and another 3% who are in agriculture, and we'd add a few more who are in services. So in fact, what Alan Blinder is telling us is another 10% of the American workforce is potentially vulnerable to outsourcing. And this is a change that is going to be effected over a certain period of time, maybe a decade or more. Now, it turns out, if you actually look, in 1970, 25% of American workers were engaged in international competition, because there's an offsetting trend, if you will, that is closing the American labor market, which, as you are very well aware of, is the shrinking share of manufacturing employment in the US. So my take on Alan's result is, if he is right, this is something for which we have to prepare, but one which, if introduced over the kind of period that you might expect, a decade or more, is something that the American labor market can handle. It would be, again, something which will cause problems for certain skills and so on. But it is a story which is very scary to Americans. And we saw a demonstration of the kind of fear it can engender in the discussions that took place when we had our sluggish recovery in 2004, when you couldn't open a newspaper without reading all about the jobs that were going to India. And it turned out it was totally based on anecdotal evidence in a way that completely distorted what was taking place. When we tried to look at how many jobs were actually being created in India, we found a significant number, 400,000, which in a 140 million employed economy is not enough to change things. So I think this is the next phase. I think you're right. It is the concern of the future. And it is one that is going to put some pressures, just as it did in manufacturing, on certain American workers. But I would not take Alan Blinder's advice and tell people that what they ought to do is to hide from international competition and try and find a job in industries that aren't exposed to the world economy.
Just to add, as many of you know, we had Alan, in fact, here last week, and we had a big session led off by Senator Baucus on the whole question of outsourcing services jobs and what that implied in the same vein that Bob is discussing now. After Alan made his presentation, we had a paper by Brad Jensen here at the Institute, who's done a really in-depth and I think pioneering analysis of the specific data on services trade with some very new conceptual work, which suggested that even the potential number of jobs to be outsourced is about half what Alan suggested. And Brad added that there's a very large potential for U.S. exports of services jobs, which would tend maybe even to totally offset the potential of jobs lost from outsourcing. So the debate, I think, is now becoming more sophisticated and more deeply analytical, and the outcome there seems to move kind of in the same direction that Robert was presenting here. Okay, back to Mike.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Lawrence. Jonathan Rausch of National Journal Magazine, a journalist, not an economist, so I may not frame this question intelligibly. Perhaps in that case you or Fred will help me with it. You say that without the pressure put on wages of international trade, blue-collar wages would be 1.5% higher. What happens if you net into that the impact on workers of lower prices? What happens to the effect of workers on workers' living standards as opposed to wages without the pressures of trade?
Well, in principle, that's already there. You're right. I mean, if we did the counterfactual, you'd have to deal with both sides of the equation, right? My 1.4 is only the downward effect on wages, ignoring the effect on living standards. So I think, in a way, a more complete evaluation would have to put that into the picture as well. So I think that's an important observation.
I might just add one point on that by way of partial quantification. Bill Klein, already mentioned for another purpose, did a major study for us quite a while back on the textile industry. And the question he raised, somewhat similar to what Robert's addressing here, is what was the income distribution effect of the import controls in the textile industry? For 40 years, we had pretty comprehensive controls on textile imports. So Bill raised the question, if I remember rightly, how did the effects of those textile import controls share out across the U.S. economy? Well, it may surprise you to learn that the only income group that benefited from the textile import controls was the top quintile. The top quintile. Why? Because they were the stockholders and the managers, and they got rents from the import control. Who were the biggest losers? The bottom quintile. Why? Because clothing is a very large share of the market basket of the poorest Americans. In fact, Bill came to a stunning conclusion that the poorest Americans suffered a loss of 5% of their total income as a result of the higher prices of clothing caused by the textile import quotas. So the concept that Robert just mentioned can be of some quantitative significance. And the question for Jonathan is, I think, a very apt one, that the loss in possibly lower wages that Robert talked about could be partially or even fully offset for at least a large part of the low-income group as a result of the gains from trade.
Although that observation is subject to the alternative critique, which is that the workers of those wages wouldn't necessarily have been the same if you hadn't had the trade protection. So you have a problem. And it's an exquisitely problematic, it just brings out the problems that you have when you try to unravel these things, because the causation is running in many different directions.
Fabulously interesting. Alice Rivlin, Brookings Institution, right across the street. You didn't say anything about the value of the dollar, and we've had a huge change. And if the dollar continues to weaken, as a lot of people think it might, how does this affect your story?
Well, I guess the prospects of generating more exports, one of the big sources of dislocation that we found in the U.S. manufacturing sector, I mean, I was quite surprised. Our study that I did with Martin from 2000 to 2003 found a much bigger effect for our weak export performance than we did for the imports that were coming into the United States, because imports are very sensitive to the cycle, and when you go into recession, your imports fall. But our exports were really hammered by the strong dollar. And we're now seeing a recovery in that. And if we had a weaker currency, it's sort of playing the thing in reverse. It raises our cost of living, but it would generate, it seems to me, more manufactured jobs. It would help our firms compete with imports, and it would help generate those exports. So on the dislocation side, I think it would help. It's more difficult to kind of trace through what the dollar would do to the price ripples into the U.S. economy, and I would have to think more about that one. But my gut reaction is that this is part of the story, although I will also say that in the study that I did with Martin, we did a simulation in which we actually got rid of the American trade deficit. We did it over a decade. And the focus of that was, well, if we do that, are we actually going to create more manufacturing jobs? Because you see, it turns out there's a horse race. If we do that, we will generate more jobs as a result of trade, but at the same time, there has been this very rapid increase in productivity growth in manufacturing. And in our simulations, in which we had sort of plausible numbers for productivity and growth in manufacturing, what we found out was at the end of the day, it was kind of a wash. So improved trade performance can help in limiting the dislocation. But even were we to close the economy, or not close the economy, but even were to close the trade imbalance, it's still unlikely to eliminate this downward movement in job availability in that sector of the economy.
John Engler, the National Association of Manufacturers. I'm curious, the productivity chart's powerful. One of the things that's happened is the proportion of the product cost that's attributable to labor has continued to plummet downward, and it's not uncommon to see industries where that labor cost is a mere fraction. Energy in many sectors could be half the product cost. Given that the labor cost has dropped so much as a proportion of product cost, I mean, if you look at that, I mean, how relevant is the labor cost at all to the ability for competitiveness?
Well, the right measure, I don't know if we can depict it accurately, and energy costs make this problematic, but what we're looking at is the value added in the sector. So in a sense, it may be true, if your observation is correct, that more value is added outside of the sector, but we are capturing value added. So productivity is the real net output per those workers, and so that would be taken into account. Remember that what these aggregate measures are doing is capturing the productivity in the whole business sector. So it's taking account of productivity not simply in a single producer who may perceive that labor is only a small component of their costs, but in the entire sector, which takes account also of those who produce those inputs.
I guess I'm looking at this implication slide as I'm asking the question, and the remedies here. I would agree protection not the answer, but in some of these, the 3 bullets there, it seems there are others that today are.
Oh, you could, yes, this is, I just mentioned my favorites, but if you left me here for long enough, I would make that list a lot longer.
Yeah, thanks. Bob, there's been some recent criticism of the productivity figures because of the reality that you have domestic companies subsidizing domestic production with China production, bringing it in, price stays the same, and you get a big jump in productivity and profitability domestically. And I was wondering if that's a valid critique, how does that affect your analysis and the data in terms of measures of profit, measures of margin, measures of productivity, wages, and so on?
It apparently made the cover of Business Week, but I found it quite impenetrable. I was unconvinced. Let me just put it to you this way. I can't give you a disquisition on all of the components, but I remember, I remember looking at that, and this kind of phenomenon has always been present, would be my answer. So it's not simply that it's there, it has to have become disproportionately larger to seriously affect those numbers. There are huge problems in the measurement of productivity. So, and that is one component, but it wouldn't lead me to question all of the analysis that I have done. And since I'm exhausted from doing this study, in fact, one of the strategic choices that I made was to try to massage the data as little as possible, so that wouldn't be the reason I was getting the conclusions that I was getting. Hi, Steve.
Steve Beckman. There's a lot of stuff to look at in the study, and I look forward to having time to do it. One of the things that struck me, though, is that you find a small impact of trade on inequality because you eliminate all the potential impact of trade on inequality in the beginning. So you've assumed that 20% or so of the inequality that's left is caused by trade, and 20% is not insignificant, and to not have that be a controversial issue seems to me a somewhat different presentation of the issue. What strikes me, though, is the skills component of the inequality that you found was relatively small, and that's been identified as one of the big contributing factors to all the problems that we see that have been attributed to trade. So I find that interesting that's a small percentage of.
No.
Well, let me get to the one. What strikes me, though, is that this price effect is huge, and I just reading it off the top of my head, I don't understand how it could be such a huge impact, since we're talking about the overall economy. We're talking about workers in all different sectors who buy all different kinds of products. They're not just buying the products they make, and so the relevant production of products and the relevant purchase of products should overlap rather substantially, and the huge effect, I mean, this is a third of the total effect is just gone. Again, so it doesn't surprise me that what you end up saying that there's only a small component of this, because you've only got 6% to deal with anyway, and the interesting things are removed in the process. Let me say one thing on the dollar. One of your charts was of the share of U.S. profits as a proportion of total value added, or value added as a total proportion of total value added. The dollar has an effect on the foreign component of that, and if you use the real value of the dollar or constant value of the dollar, the percentages might change much more dramatically than they did in your chart.
No, let me be clearer. There are two components where skills play a role in this gap between the blue-collar workers' wages and productivity. One is what I call their wage inequality. And wage inequality is actually about the increasing returns to skill. So the college premium has risen, the white-collar workers are getting disproportionately high wages because of that. So in that sense, skills are playing a big role. So that's 6.8, what I called wage inequality. Then there's a second skills element, which is that the white-collar workers are becoming increasingly skilled. Okay, more and more white-collar workers, and so that is the part that was the second effect. So that's why it's not, so the skills story is, in a sense, the whole story about college education is captured by both of those. I don't produce the consumer price index, and I don't produce the deflator for output, you know, so, and yet they behave very, very differently. Housing is about, I guess, 20% of the consumer price index, so that's a significant part of it. Imports are obviously not produced by American workers, that's a part of it. But my sense is that the other part is capital goods. You know, a lot of the productivity growth, certainly up until the late 90s, was centered in the so-called non-electrical machinery sector, in computers, in semiconductors. So those prices were falling, but they are disproportionately going into capital goods. So that's how I understand what that's about. I just want to go back, just one point about Tom. Tom asked the question, you know, how come these CEO salaries didn't skyrocket before? What was it that suddenly allowed them to do so? Well, the one thing that does fit the timing is the prices of the assets. Now, that may be just pushing the problem into somewhere else. Now, tell me why the stock market rose. But in a sense, that's the, that is a connection. Now, it's an astute observation because in the literature, when people have tried to take the model that actually uses rational explanations for the CEO pay increases in the 90s and does quite well, and then tries to extrapolate back to the 1930s, the model doesn't work too well. So it is quite possible that, and that's why I believe it's some combination of the rational explanation and something more related to norms and power struggles and things that are much harder to measure.
Bob, I just want to get your thoughts on some puzzles that your study leaves and for the general analytics. I mean, the first puzzle is much of the explanation for the widening wage gap in the 80s and early 90s was skill-biased technological change. Well, I think you're right. One of the most striking findings you have is that the ratio of college to high school wages, or the skill differential basically stopped rising about 2000. Now, it's a little hard to believe that, you know, skill-biased technological change suddenly took a holiday, and that, you know, there's something radically different about the last few years. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on where that leaves us with that particular paradox. The second paradox for trade economists is it seems to me that over years we've had fairly good demonstrations that trade behaves according to comparative advantage, and you sort of tend to document that, yeah, no great paradoxes there. Well, your relative wage stories from even the disaggregated manufacturing, at first blush would sort of say, well, comparative advantage is out the window. The U.S. no longer has a comparative advantage in skilled versus unskilled labor. So it seems to me you may have raised a few problems for the profession in the contributions you made here.
Well, as I read the literature among the labor economists, they have had increasing problems in applying the skill-biased technical change at a detailed level, in sort of tracing out how this exactly operates. Now Larry Michel at the Economic Policy Institute was a prescient and early skeptic about the skill-biased technical change explanation. And so you've now had a rethinking, and the theory is becoming more complicated in order to account for the facts. Larry Katz is wrestling with this problem of why it is that all the workers at the bottom are doing reasonably well. It's the middle that seems to be taking it on the chin, and the upper 90th percentile is doing well. And so we now have three-factor models where the technical change is somehow skewing towards the middle and the top, and leaving those at the bottom unaffected. And Janet Yellen had an interesting speech in which she described, building on Larry's work, this idea that somehow, well, the people in the services economy aren't so susceptible to this technical change, but others are. But there are a lot of problems now in tracing the skill-biased technological change, in detail, in actually identifying it with computers or something like that. So all I would say is and this actually takes me to your second question, if it requires if the labor economists are going back to the drawing board, maybe so too should the trade economists. I still believe that those stories of comparative advantage tell us things about the patterns of specialization for developing countries. I do think, though, that our orientation towards products needs to be refined, and we need to look at processes, precisely because the production chain is being sliced. And the essence of the new comparative advantage is that individual products contain components that are skilled and some components that are relatively unskilled. And what developing countries can do in a world where the customs work well and transportation systems work well is to integrate and to specialize in particular activities.
Final question, Frank Markham.
I think trade still works. Frank Markham, NAM. Trade still works and economics still works. In preparing for this excellent session, David Huth, our chief economist, did a little back-of-the-envelope work. If anyone's interested, we can elaborate. But he found that if we break manufacturing into three sectors, the most trade engaged, and that includes electronics and apparel, computers, etc., the real wage gains from 2001 to 2006 were 10%. In the middle one-third, which includes aircraft, textiles, primary materials, primary metals, the real wage gains were 6%. And the least trade engaged, those that import and export the least, the wage gains were only 5%. So this would corroborate theory that the more you trade, the more you're in comparative advantage, and the better off your wages are. We'd be happy to share that.
Well, I do think that I don't know if I want to push it that far. What I would say, though, and did surprise me again, was that union wages, and in a sense in some of those sectors which are engaged in trade, wages held up very well. Now, part of it is that these tend to be high-wage jobs that come with benefits, and you won't see it in the pure wage data. You'll see it in the compensation data because they've been able to get decent benefits and health care. So I think that is a part of the process, and it is because of that I am skeptical that trade is the transmission mechanism for the declining share of wages in national income. because I would have expected the pressure to be felt most strongly in those particular sectors. Now, the very recent data do show some weakness. It's not quite the same story as you did see in the earlier period.